Good day, I'm Brian Ganson. I'm head of the Africa Center for Dispute Settlement here at the University of Stellenbosch Business School. We're here at USB's Leaders Angle. Today I'm going to talk about leadership qualities for conflict-prone environments. Enjoy the talk. Here, as part of the University of Stellenbosch Business School, our primary focus is research, understanding why there's conflict, where there's conflict, what's standing in the way of resolving conflict, what we can do about it. But we like to do that together with the people who are part of those conflicts. We feel that we make a bigger difference when we work directly with business, with government, with community groups, with international organizations who care about conflict and its resolution. Our main mission is actionable insight. What can we learn that would make a difference in how we manage and resolve conflict? But we also engage in ways that are appropriate to parties in conflict. So most of our researchers are themselves facilitators, mediators, negotiation specialists, so that we can actually work together with stakeholders in what matters to them. And so that's the story of the Africa Center. We should spend just a moment, I think, understanding what we mean by a conflict-prone environment. We also use the term fragile environment. We use the term complex environment. There might be some differences on the margins, but for today's talk, we can consider those all the same. What we really mean are three things. The first is that in a conflict-prone environment, we find pronounced socio-political stresses. What do we mean by that? That means extreme poverty. It means legacies of the past, whether that be from armed conflict or whether that be from apartheid. It means that we have differences of opinion that are pronounced about what kind of society we should be, playing out in countries like Venezuela. Are we pursuing a market model, a socialist model? And that means that the tensions are high. The second element we have to pay attention to in understanding conflict-prone environments is that the socio-political infrastructure, the formal systems of government, the informal ways in which people relate to each other, are insufficient to deal with the problems in front of us. And then the third, where we say that the power relationships and the institutional structures make it harder to solve problems. So why does that matter to us as business leaders and people who care about business in society? First of all, investment in conflict-prone environments is sharply on the uprise. For the first time, 2014, there was more foreign investment in the developing world than there was in the global north. More money going into Latin America, Africa, Southeast Asia than there was going into Europe or going into the Americas. The largest investor in Africa for the first time ever is Africa. There is more African money flowing from one African country to another than there is European or American or Japanese money flowing into Africa. The second thing we need to be aware of is, even as we're getting more investment in, the social stresses are increasing. Part of this is climate change, the drought. Part of it is population growth, migration, urbanization. All of these are stresses on society, but also factors like inequality. The awareness that the inequality gap is getting broader rather than narrower means that places that are already difficult are becoming more stressed. And we put those two together, more investment into difficult places, more stresses in the environment, and we end up with the fact that conflict related to business is endemic. We find it everywhere. The cost to business is enormous. We saw that here in South Africa from one event, the Marikana Massacre. If you were a Lonman shareholder, you saw your share value drop 30% in 1 week, more than $2 billion in losses in the subsequent platinum sector strike. Of course, it's not just a financial story, it is not just a business story. The cost to society is much, much higher than just the profits or losses of business. We got to ask this question: how do we succeed in a complex environment? What makes a difference to a business in a conflict-prone place? And that led to an ongoing research project. We continue this work, but a resting point for us was this book, Management in Complex Environments. The number one thing we found out, the most important thing, if you only take one thing away from the talk this morning, it's that companies are the authors of their own risk and their own risk mitigation in conflict-prone environments. When I was a postgrad student more years ago than I care to admit, risk was out there. Risk was something you studied. Risk was something you paid a consultant to assess. And then you decided whether you had the risk appetite to go to a place like Zimbabwe or Venezuela or South Africa for that matter. What we've learned in the intervening decades, and confirmed by this research, is that's not the story. Yes, there are riskier places and less risky places, but it's mostly about what we do in those places. So we found examples where many companies were failing as part of the Arab Spring because of the chaos in the societies around them, but we found a company that reported to us that they had their best year ever in the middle of the Egyptian Revolution. And therefore, we need to understand what distinguishes these companies that are operating effectively despite complexity, and what can we understand about their leaders? Because this was never driven from the headquarters level. And most importantly, because doing it in one place wasn't going to mean that doing it in another was going to make a difference. The environments were too different. What qualities did they share? What should we be looking for and cultivating in our leaders? And I want to walk you through a little bit about what we found. The number one thing was curiosity. What we experienced and what we heard from all of the stakeholders we talked to was effective leaders in conflict-prone environments are always learning. They're always listening. They're always asking, what's going on here? How do I understand the environment in which I find myself? If I have a reaction to something and I'm surprised or I'm upset, that's probably a signal that I haven't learned enough. I have more to understand before I can say I'm ready to take action. Very often that's around power relationships, right? How are decisions actually being made? One of the very important things that gets missed is how do things actually get done, right? We're so primed to understand what's wrong, what's missing, what are the gaps in a place. We don't understand a place until we also understand the sources of strength and resilience, the community networks, the family networks, the alliances that people build in order to make things better. The second quality of these leaders is contextual understanding, a very fine sense of how the company and the environment interact with each other. How does the environment affect the company? How does the company affect the environment? What do we mean by that? We mean that we know that when we take a lot of money and activity that comes with a large-scale investment, it has an impact on the local community and on the governance happening around it. Now, we're attuned to the most visible parts, right? I mean, if we're going to build a dam or develop a palm oil plantation, there's a lot of visible impact on the land, on potentially on resettlement, on water use. But what about the less evident changes? Am I paying attention to the impact of that investment by understanding what's going on in the environment where we fit in, it's not only a matter of avoiding doing bad, we find opportunities to do good, but that requires that contextual understanding. The third quality is a sense of responsibility. You can get away with a lot, right? The Economist famously said, there are rich pickings in dangerous places. And of course, our economics colleagues tell us that's easy to understand. If you can externalize all your social and economic costs, your profits go up, right? And it's only through a sense of responsibility that companies manage to color within the lines, at least in the immediate term. And the leaders we spoke with were highly aware of that they needed to increase their internal checks because the external checks and balances weren't always in place. And that very often meant consultation at the local level. It's not enough to read the legislation and say, oh, we're allowed to do this. We really have to check in with people and say, how do you feel about this? Because it's a system that's not working, right? Maybe the national government isn't taking into account the needs and the interests of the local population. Rigor. We have to work harder. We have to think harder. We have to collaborate harder in these conflict-prone environments. We describe conflict-prone environments as being rumor-rich and information-poor. Rumors will abound. Conflict will rise as somebody decides it's the company that must be at fault, because after all, they came and then the fish died. And so the companies we studied and the leaders in those companies spent an inordinate amount of time trying to get to the root of the matter, really understand what's happening here, and most importantly, to do that together with the people around them. And that is, helps us transition to our fifth quality, this collaborative mindset. And what we saw in the leaders of these companies, they said, look, we know we are imposing to some extent. We're bringing stress. Hopefully, we're also bringing benefits. And that's what we aspire to, but we also do understand that we're bringing stresses. And partnership has to mean we make their agenda our agenda. I'm only your partner if I am helping you accomplish your goal, right? Bringing you into benefiting from my goal, that's the cost of doing business. But when I can get on board with your agenda, then we start to see changes happening. And the leaders we worked with were looking for those opportunities. Where can I get on board with somebody else's agenda to build their confidence in us? And then organizational savvy. One of the things we learned is that large international organizations are poorly designed to manage within conflict-prone environments. Headquarters is always saying, what are your sales going to be in the next 3 years? To which a savvy person says, it depends. We don't know. We're going to position ourselves for opportunity, but accept that we might have to change course along the way, either because we decide to or somebody else tells us that we need to. And so we have to start thinking about how do we adapt our systems and processes. We have to understand where are our internal processes dependent on external processes, right? Which may fail. And so then how do we compensate for that? So there we go. 6 qualities that jumped out in our research of leaders who succeed in conflict-prone environments. So what do you get from this? So okay, this all sounds actually like a lot of work. I have to do everything I have to do to make a business succeed in a more stable environment, and I have to do all of this too, so what do I get out of it? Well, first thing we see is from a risk management perspective, it turns out to be pretty good. Opportunity. We also reduce conflict. We saw family incomes going up. We saw primary school attendance going up, we saw health outcomes going up, right? So again, we know that the private sector needs to be part of bringing people out of poverty, and the evidence seems to be that if we do it right, it can be, despite all the cases where it's not. And those cases, we again need to emphasize they don't need to be. Where we see business in conflict in fragile places, we know we can do better, and we should demand that. We should demand that as shareholders, we should demand that as citizens.